Greetings, all. It's always a happy day here at Trailblazers Impact. I'm Dee Dee Strum, and I always have the pleasure of being the co-host, along with Nan McKay and Donna Miller, for the many interviews we conduct with ordinary women who have just achieved extraordinary heights in their profession. It's my privilege today to introduce to you Ms. Donna Butts, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Generations United, often referred to as GU. Ms. Butts has committed a lifetime, and I literally mean a lifetime, to advancing the work of local and national nonprofits through her professional, public policy, and literary contributions as it relates to supporting the health and well-being of families of all ages, family members, intergenerational. And she's going to talk a little bit about Generations United and its mission when she introduces herself. Donna started as a youth worker with YWCA in her home state of Oregon several decades ago, has become over the years a recognized expert in the field of intergenerational family connections, as evidenced by her frequent and marquee level interviews, publications, and public testimony on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. So I want to start by saying good morning, Donna. And in preparing for this interview, I have read lots of material about you, by you, and all of which have raised many, many questions that I would love to have you answer during the interview, but I know that our time is limited, and I want to again let you know how much I respect your time. So thank you for carving this time out this morning to do the interview. I'd like to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you're doing.
Thank you, Dee Dee. It's really an honor to be with you this morning and to have a chance to chat. I'm so impressed with the work that you've done and that you continue to do to bring attention to, I love your tagline, ordinary women with extraordinary achievements. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to join you. I've been with Generations United for over 20 years. And as you're right, my life's been dedicated beginning with teenagers who I dearly loved, to develop and grow and be very supportive of families and of intergenerational relationships and intergenerational connections, which I think really make our communities and our country stronger. With Generations United, we were organized and formed over 30 years ago. And I love what one of our founders said, Jack Osofsky, when they were incorporating Generations United. It was founded by the leading children, youth, and aging organizations. And he said, we formed Generations United to argue for a caring society. And I believe that that is very much our mission. It's the work that we engage in every day. It's the standard that our staff, our wonderful board of directors, our members, and our network around the country, it's a value that they hold very dear, that we believe that we can and should have a society that values, protects, and engages its most important, its bookend generations, its older and its youngest. And that's what really holds our society together. So our work at Generations United is really, we don't necessarily do the direct work. We're the ones that help to make it stronger. We set the standards, we award and recognize really good work that's underway around the country, and we're connected internationally as well. But we are the umbrella that pulls people together so they know they're not the only ones, that there are other like spirits, that they have a tribe, that they have a organization as well as a movement that they're a part of. So I have felt just incredibly honored to be the head of the organization and to work with amazing people as we've been growing the mission, growing the work, and I think making some and having some significant impact. In particular, one of the areas that we focused for over 20 years is grandparents and other relatives raising children, grand families. And to watch the change, to watch the supports, to watch what we've been able to do, working with the families and with the families' voices and with the families leading what we've been able to accomplish. But in a number of other areas as well, whether it's combining childcare and adult daycare so that young and old can be together in a setting, whether it's older adults in service tutoring young people or young people in service to older adults, or young and old serving together. There are just amazing examples around the country. And again, I'm just very honored to do the work.
Thank you. As I said in my brief introduction, reading about you raised so many questions, so many conversations that I'd like to have with you. But drilling down on one in particular that has just resonated with me for the last few weeks is with your organization's statement of mission and core values and beliefs on the Generations United website. One in particular sticks out to me, and it's a reference to a core belief in intergenerational approaches to have a positive relationship to economic growth and value creation. And I believe the reason that that one has really, really resonated with me and raised a burning question for me is because of the current national dialogue that's being pushed out by our Biden-Harris administration, the national administration, on including funding in the somewhat, really controversial infrastructure bill. The Biden-Harris administration has proposed almost a $2 trillion bill to support infrastructure in both its traditional context of bridges, tunnels, highways, sort of what we call the brick and mortar infrastructure. And they are reimagining infrastructure, so to speak. They are re-engineering the conversation, the dialogue in the 21st century for infrastructure to include, of course, that which they see as most critical to our society, which is the infrastructure for families, in order for families to even and working persons, whether it's the men in the household or the women in the household, to really be able to contribute to what, again, one of your core beliefs is this positive relationship to economic growth and value creation. And yet we see that the opposition often that, for the last 40 years has tried to own, I call at least in their mind, the space they call the party of family values, pushing back against this. And we talk about reform of public education in the 21st century, reforming healthcare, reforming government and elected politics. And so why not re-inform how we think of infrastructure? And if it's not for the benefit of families, and particularly now intergenerational families, given COVID, I'd like to know your thoughts on it. And I saw an article, well, it was actually a chapter of a book that you authored in 2005 that talks about a covenant between government and its people. And so I guess to pitch my question to you is, with all of my rambling, what are your reflections now, 15, 16 years later, after authoring a chapter of a book on the covenant between government and its people, now having a federal administration that says we need to reimagine infrastructure as that which is necessary to support our families, our citizens from cradle to graveyard, so to speak, and why this is such a heated debate to see funding in this area as infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important comment and point that you're making, because I do believe in that covenant between government, between families, between neighbors, between community members. And it's interesting how, when I think about intergenerational programs, for example, a lot of times people would tell me, oh, intergenerational programs are so sweet, they're nice, they're soft, they're optional. They just kind of happen, and they happen over there, and we don't have to really worry about supporting that kind of connection. Whereas we know that there are really important foundations that to intergenerational programming, that they're not soft and sweet. They're necessary. They help develop strong communities. They're the backbone of a lot of our society. And I think that that's a little bit of what's happened with family, is that families, we've always, in some ways in this society, have developed this idea that it's best to be independent. We're not interdependent. We don't need each other. And that families can function successfully without any sort of outside support or assistance. And with grand families, what we found when we first became involved with that issue is people who said, it's really sad, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and these people are having to raise children after they've already, made mistakes, when in fact that wasn't the case. And what we know is that grandparents and other relatives raising children can raise healthy, successful children, but they don't do it on their own. They need some supports and some assistance. It's a part of the infrastructure of our country. Our families are a foundation to healthy communities, to healthy neighborhoods. Our government, our roads, everything, nothing can do well and without that foundational piece of healthy families. And the way that we define family varies also. And most people will agree that that families are a natural foundation. And that's what we need to do, whether it's a grand family, whether it's an extended family, whether it's a multi-generational household that's living in a family together and supporting each other. Families deserve our support. And so I think that now, with the infrastructure bill that's being considered, that it's very, very important that families are a part of that infrastructure, because nobody's going to build those roads, nobody's going to drive over those bridges if we don't have families raising healthy children. If we have families that are worried about an isolated older adult who can't get the support or care that they deserve, nobody's going to function if our families and that extended family is not functioning. So it is a part of our infrastructure. We need to fight for families. And I'm not saying that it's that whole thing about people. When you talk about things like this, people think, oh, you're talking about giving, about handouts, about, propping people up. It's not. It's about some of the basic things, like usually a woman can't go to work if there's not childcare, because that caregiving responsibility falls on her. If we have elders that don't have access to care, we can't work, we can't function. It's something that is just really fundamental in our country. And I think that we all need to own family, and that we all need to understand that we have an obligation and that covenant and that commitment to supporting families.
Well, I want to thank you for allowing me to force you to think back to your 2005 publication all these years later. But I want to now bring it forward in the context of your more recent, I call big win, which were the study. You had a national study that was commissioned, and I read it, the summary of it, along with one that you commissioned 10 years earlier. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that particular effort, a public policy initiative to get the data to support some of the positions that Generations United takes, and the history of that going back to 10 years ago versus then what you subsequently commissioned. And then what were some of those major conclusions or recommendations or findings that you now again see really, really important, and again, particularly given the context of the global pandemic?
Dee Dee, I'm really glad that you asked about the report, because I do think it's really, really fascinating. With multi-generational households, this country was founded with multi-generational households.
True.
We couldn't have farmed the land, we couldn't have settled, we couldn't have cut the wood, we couldn't have done any of the things that we did without extended families. And it really has only been in the last century that those families started to separate a lot for work, the need to travel, to go elsewhere, to find work. And so families started to separate more. And so we actually got down to a fairly low number of multi-generational households. And then it was the Great Recession over 10 years ago where we started to see another, that change, to start to see a dramatic increase in multi-generational households. But what was interesting back then is that people said, well, as soon as the economy does better, that number, those multi-generational households are going to start to diminish. The numbers will start to go down. But in fact, the numbers continued to increase. And what I said is they may have come together by need, they stayed together by choice. Because what we found is that it really helps members of the family. They don't have to worry as much about caregiving. It's easier to have that extra pair of hands in the house, especially during COVID, to help when children were needing to be homeschooled. So to have that extra pair of hands, to share the financial responsibility, to share cooking, to share, to be there to prop each other up in an organic, natural kind of way. And so what we thought was going to occur is what has occurred. Because of COVID, the numbers are again spiking or again increasing because people are realizing they lean on family. They lean and they support each other and they help each other out. So what we found was now there's about 1 in 4 adult Americans, 26%, that live in a multi-generational household. And that number has quadrupled in the last 10 years. We were really surprised when we saw the significance in the increase. It went from 7% that we found 10 years ago to 26% in this most recent survey. So it's a really striking increase. And a number of them, 57%, said that they came together because of COVID. But what I really think is interesting is that 72% of them say they're going to stay together even after the pandemic. So there may have been some initiation because of the pandemic. But again, what families are finding is it makes sense for a lot of families to, again, pool resources, be able to depend on each other, and live sometimes not always stress-free, because there are things that you have to work out, just as in any relationship or any family. And it's not for everybody, but there's a number of families who it does work for. And what we need to change in our society is this idea that there's something wrong with it, that they're not able to function on their own, that they're not independent. We have to realize that they are found a stronger way through it, a better future. And we all need to support that through our public policies, through our media, through the way we organize programs, and even build our houses.
And speaking of build our houses, I attended a webinar that you did 2 or 3 weeks ago. And it was the sharing of the summary of these 2 studies that you commissioned with the Harris Poll organization, and you had panel members that spoke. But the architect that participated, I really was fascinated by some of the information that he shared around design, design of the homes to accommodate multi-generational families. But there was a lady that spoke, and I don't remember her background or anything, but it was like the sharing of her story about the pandemic hitting, the need for she and her husband to continue to work, that they, both were required to start working from home. They had young children. The young children had to now attend school from home. There was no one to help the young children because they needed to work and they needed to devote the time to work. And in some, I guess, early meeting with and I don't remember if it was the wife's parents or the husband's parents, there was an agreement they needed to come together because the retired grandparents were more than willing and actually pleased to have the opportunity to help with the grandchildren and the schooling. The part that, and again, I know that that's a story that probably is repeated across America, but the most fascinating thing that I remember this lady sharing is that they decided that as opposed to trying to find a house that would accommodate all of them under one roof, to respect the need for the 2 different households, so to speak, and the space, while still figuring out a strategy to have collateral benefit to both. And the 2 families, the grandparents, and then the parents with the children, all decided they were going to look for 2 houses. And she described it as their move, that when they talked with their realtor, the realtor had to find them 2 houses that were next door to each other. And so she described it as a multi-generational family, but they only lived across the driveway. And she said that the children would leave their home in the morning to go across the driveway to the grandparents' house. The grandparents then prepared breakfast for the children, got them logged onto the computer on time, and the children spent the school hours with the grandparents. And then the grandparents did the homework. But of course, the grandparents were exhausted probably at the end of the day with the, being the homeschooling team. And they sent the kids back across the driveway to the parents, who were happy to see them at the end of the workday. I thought that was the most fascinating and intriguing story that I had heard during the pandemic. of how they thought that through. Are there any other instances or examples that you can share that you really consider to be innovative or cutting edge, having now done the study and all the conversations that you've had with your other organizations about what families have been doing during the pandemic to address this need for greater reliance on each other?
Dee Dee, I think that story is one of the absolute best, because that was an example where families were able to purchase two homes right side by side. And what we've seen is that oftentimes what will happen is there's either is that opportunity to remodel, like the
Architect.
Yeah, that you were describing. He actually built a suite over their garage for his in-laws. And one of the things that he loves is that his mother-in-law is a retired chef. So since they've moved in, he's eating so much better because she cooks. So people are either there's remodeling, or there's buying homes that are designed with an in-law. It's not really separate, but it's a separate entrance. But the houses are connected as well. There are accessory dwelling units, which might mean somebody building or putting a small module in their backyard.
Okay.
And so those, and it's really interesting because some areas fight that because of density, whereas what we think about is family. It's allowing families to live together, because the situation you're talking about, what we saw during the pandemic, I think it really elevated for people in this country how horribly we treat our older people, how we isolate them and put them off and warehouse them in some ways, and they're not engaged. And people became very worried about their parents if they were living in a facility and they weren't able to see them, get to them. If they're living across the driveway, if they're living in a suite that's connected to your house, they're going to be a part of the family. You're going to know that they're okay. So we've seen a lot of people, move families in. The other thing that we've seen, and I thought this was really interesting, because one of my doctors actually retired at the beginning of the pandemic to help with his grandchildren. So they don't live together, but he spends 2 days a week with taking those children out away, just as you described, away from the parents, has an absolutely wonderful time with them, and then is able to bring them back. But we've seen so many grandparents or older relatives that have stepped in to try to support families because of that need for children to continue to be educated and parents to work. So those are some of the things that we've really seen be beneficial for people when it comes to care, when it comes to still being able to try to continue education. Where I'm worried is in particular with grandparents raising grandchildren with grandfamilies. The COVID pandemic has been incredibly hard on them because you're talking about older and younger people. And remember, at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout, we were told that older people should isolate, stay away from children, that these older adults are raising the children. They couldn't separate. And you're talking about a generation or generations that aren't as comfortable with technology. And now they've got children that they had to try to help homeschool without internet, without broadband, without understanding the equipment needs. And so it's really very important, bless you, that we take care of and look out for those families and help with any learning loss, but be able to support their good work in raising children.
Donna, one of the questions I have is where families don't have the luxury of that accessory dwelling unit or living across the driveway, putting modifications on a home. What have you all found to be some techniques or tips? What can families do to relieve the stressors that are also associated many times with multi-generational households?
You're right, because a lot of families, they either come together suddenly and don't have time really to prepare the space, or they come together because of economic situation and they don't have the money to buy a new house or to build a new house, or some of the families that we know who have multiple dwellings on the same piece of property. And so they're in a smaller space. So the number one thing that we always advise is to have open discussions about why you're living together, what the expectations are, and that you have an informal or formal covenant or compact between the family members so that you understand. Because, for example, I remember when my aunt, when a couple of her grandchildren moved into her house, and when I was asking her, well, tell me some of the secrets, how do you make it work? And she said, most important thing is to realize that nobody's going to change for you. That if somebody is a night owl, they're going to be a night owl. If somebody's a slob, they're going to be a slob. And so it's coming up with how you make that work. It's great if there can be even a bedroom that is or a small room that's a separate space, or that people can take shifts having, so that they have time. We all need time away from each other. It's very important, just as in any relationship, to understand the finances. If somebody's moving in with you because they've lost a job, and when they start to make money again, does that mean that they're going to be helping with bills going forward, or bills that you've already paid? Because if they start spending their money in a way that you don't think they should be spending it, it causes tension. So there's that discussion and revisiting. And what we oftentimes see works so well is that people develop those kind of natural ways that they each excel. For example, some households, somebody might be the cook, and somebody else might be the dishwasher, and somebody else might make sure that the dog gets walked, or, but people have different roles or chores or ways to keep the household functioning. We did hear from the families that really high on the list of what helps them function successfully is the number of bedrooms and bathrooms. Because we interviewed one family where I think there were 5 people in one bathroom, and it gets really tight if you're trying to juggle that. But people can make it work. But it's really important to have those conversations and have the understandings.
In terms of geography, I'm just curious, did your study cover regions of the nation, so to speak, and find where the highest clusters might be found of multi-generational families, and then maybe the success or non-success of that arrangements, or what gave rise to it, if it's tradition or something else that's associated with regional characteristics?
Yeah, there are a few things that were multi-generational families are more prevalent in the South and the West Coast, less so in the Northeast. And they're also more prevalent where we have higher numbers of immigrant families. And a lot of that is because of culture. When I work with my colleagues around the world, they're amazed at how low our number of multi-generational households is, because it's so much higher in other parts of the world, because they never did separate in the way that people in this country did. So it's higher among immigrant families. It's much more culturally acceptable. And where there's space, I think the Northeast sometimes there's a little bit more congested. But in terms of other cultures, it really cuts across. What I found really interesting from the study also is that the majority had household incomes of over $100,000. Because sometimes people get in their head this stereotype that it's, lower income people who are all crowded into one little house trying to survive together, when in fact the majority had advanced degrees and incomes over $100,000. So what I really appreciate, and what we're trying to do, is really push against some of the society norms so that this is acceptable, it's okay, it's normal. I remember doing a radio interview 10 years ago when our first study came out, and the interviewer kept pushing me to say that it was so sad that these families had to live together, and he'd never want to live with his mother-in-law, and how awful it was. And then he opened the phone lines up, and everybody who called in lived in a multi-generational family and talked about how successful it was and how great it was. And that's what our study found this time too. Over 90% of the families said that it worked for them, that they were successful at living together. So our society needs to catch up with that. that it is successful, it is normal, it is strong, and it's a strong way for us to go forward.
Well, I have to say, you just answered what was going to be my closing question to you, which is what do you see as the biggest takeaway for the work that you're doing right now? But I think you just summarized it, which is normalizing the idea that multi-generational families doesn't equate to dysfunction, so to speak. And in many ways, it makes the family much more functional. And if you have another big takeaway, or if you disagree with my interpretation, my synthesizing that, please share that with us in bringing this interview to a successful close.
I think you're really right that is the point, that they function, and they function better. And that again goes back to the role of government that we were talking about, which is they function well, they function successfully, but there are supports that the government can and should provide to make sure that families function stronger, successfully, and that they thrive. I think also, even beyond the family, for us to realize that we have a society and a world that is aging, and the way that we think about older adults, the way that we engage older adults, that whether it's in a family or in a community, that we should never let that important human capital sit by the wayside, that people of all ages and at all stages of life need and can and should be involved in their communities, because we're all stronger when we're working together.
Well, thank you for that closing message, particularly in the context of the valuable human capital that this nation and this world has, and investing in it. So thank you, Donna. I really appreciate it. On behalf of myself, co-host Nan McKay, and Donna Miller, I just cannot thank you enough for taking the time this morning to join us on Trailblazers Impact and sharing with us a, I think, very critically important conversation to where we are today, in the 21st century, the second decade, and facing a 100-year pandemic and the changes that it has made for us. And as you said, for many, without advance notice or planning, and multi-generational households. I think for many reasons, I suspect you're right. They're here to stay, and they are not synonymous with dysfunction. So thank you again for the time, and also for your professional contributions to this important body of work.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Dee Dee, for the opportunity to have a conversation with you.